A very big welcome to, excuse me, to another lightning talk, part of the Learning Education Development Research Centre seminar. I'm afraid I'm a substitute today. Sally Elton-Chalcroft, who's the director who normally chairs these talks, is unable to be with us today, but sends her apologies and regrets missing it. So I'll just try and do whatever it takes to chair this there. So very big welcome to you all. As I said, we are expecting someone to join us maybe about 10 minutes late, who's an external to the university, which is great. So today, welcome to James Burch, who's going to be talking a little bit about teacher education, teacher educators, and as normal, perhaps you could switch your buttons to mute so that we're not getting any background noise while he's talking. And I'll monitor the chat box. So if you want to ask questions, we'll leave James to talk first, if that's all right, and then we'll see whether we've got questions. And it may be until that point that you would want to wait to ask them. With many thanks. And gratefully, and we're still looking for people to offer to do these lightning talks in the autumn, I think. So we'll perhaps catch up with that again at the end. So James, over to you.
Oh, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see so many colleagues I recognise, although it's just from your icons, which I suppose is your interpretation of reality and how you want to appear, but it's nice to see you again. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Burch, and I actually retired 5 years ago. And I was just saying to Heather she said, you're obviously doing quite a lot of work. And I said, well, I retired from teacher education in order to concentrate on teacher education. So that's what I've been doing for the past 5 years or so, and continuing to do so. So what's today about? It's about a longitudinal study. It actually took place in your institution over the period of one academic year, and it examined how, and with an underpinning rationale, an experienced teacher educator helped her students to see into practice with theoretical understanding. And that was the key idea. There were two sub questions. Sub question one was, what was the role of theory for the teacher educator and the student teachers? And two, what were the affordances and constraints of this whole process? So I'm going to just run through my motivation for wanting to do the study. I'm going to sort of lightly skip over the methodology, and you may want to come back and ask me lots of questions about that. And then I will go into a little bit more detail over the generated findings and the implications for practice. I apologize if you're not a teacher educator. There will be quite a lot of teacher educator related stuff, but hopefully some of the methodology things may be of interest to you. So what was my motivation, first of all, for the research? Well, it was curiosity. And I was doing a project with some students, and I was examining how what they saw when they looked at practice. And the practice we're looking at here is modern languages practice. And I played them a small clip from a government publication on so-called best practice. And I was interested in what they saw in that and how they could improve it. And I was absolutely astonished. This was on a focus group type basis. So they were discussing amongst themselves and I was listening. And I was intrigued to note that they were using a whole range of theoretical frameworks. These were one-year PGC students to look at the practice they had just viewed, and also to project an image of how they could take that practice and improve it. They were using things like procedural versus declarative knowledge, rich input, struggling to arrive at meaning, cognitive ease versus cognitive strain. And it was just tripping off the tongue, and it was just working wonderfully. And there was a sort of energizing esprit de corps in their conversations. And I thought, hold on a moment, this is not supposed to happen, because this runs completely counter to most of the truisms in teacher education about students hating theory. I mean, I can think of one or two studies where that is not the case, but by and large, that is the general trend. So I then said, this would be interesting to, excuse me, to explore further. So I talked with the person who was responsible for teaching these students, and a couple of years later, I was fortunate enough to do a longitudinal study to see what it was that was going on in this particular branch of teacher education that seemed to indicate that students were liking theory. So that was my motivation. I wasn't looking particularly for a gap in the research. This was about localized understandings, situated understandings, rich description, etc. But I did discover as I was reading around it that I'd actually stumbled across something else that was quite interesting. In fact, three other things. Number one, that studies of this type are very rare. That's to say, studies where there's a emphasis on the in-classroom interactions between a teacher educator and his or her students over a long period of time. Most studies tend to interview people afterwards and say, well, what did you do and what was it like? But this was actually going to be in the classroom over a period of a year. Secondly, the featuring of students in such studies is equally rare, apparently, according to Zeichner 2005. And also, the whole role of teacher educator and the ability to go from practical experiences and see how your students react and draw down theoretical implications from that is actually quite a rare skill. And there's a lot of research done by Courthardt and Lunenberg and Sven and others on that particular aspect. So I'd sort of stumbled into, I thought, a really interesting area. So how did it work? Well, over the period of a year, and for those of you who are not familiar with the PGC languages course, there's a big dollop at the start of about 4 or 5 weeks. So it's front-end loaded, which itself is problematic in many respects, but we won't go into that. There's another dollop after Christmas for about 5 or 6 weeks, and there's a week in June. And the students come back periodically for sessions, for sort of top-ups and stuff. So of those possible lectures, etc., sessions, I observed 48 hours of teaching, which amounted to 16 3-hour sessions. And the format was that after each session, a debriefing interview took place with the teacher educator. So you've got your notes from the observations and you've got this still hot empirical material. It's all very exciting. And you then, the teacher educator, because this was a very active stance towards interviewing, would start off by telling me what she had done and, above all, her underpinning rationale for it. And I could then come in with actual additional questions to almost fight the familiar and sort of get me into what was unfamiliar as well. So it was a very dialogic, active approach to interviewing. It was a collaborative enterprise of exploration. And I can talk about the philosophical underpinnings for that later on if you want as well. So there were 16 such interviews. They were audio recorded, and the first one I had transcribed professionally, but from that point onwards, I decided, as the jargon goes, to handle my own rat. In other words, I did the transcriptions myself, and that had a profound effect, I think, on the research and the thinking that went into it. Again, that may be something you may want to ask me about. In addition to that, those observations and the follow-up interviews, the debriefings as we called them, there were 4 major interviews with the teacher educator throughout the year, spaced out to draw out themes that we'd been discussing. And there's probably about 8 hours of interviews there. And I also ran focus groups with the students, and the focus groups with the students happened at 2 points in the year. They involved about half the course. They represented a good cross-section of the people on the course as well. And they took place after Christmas, and they took place in June. And I tried to make those as naturalistic as possible by giving the students a sort of starter, like learning to teach is like, and they would just start discussing. Now, that was a high-risk strategy because I was actually interested in their views on theory. And but I had to let the discussions flow according to, what they were, what the impetus had sort of catalyzed. It's like dropping a pebble into a pond and you're watching it ripple out, and you're hoping those ripples are actually going to be quite useful for you. So they were the sort of data generation methods. The framework I used for analyzing, I didn't have an external framework I brought in. I used lots of perspectives from the literature on teacher education that related to the research questions. And again, I can tell you what they were later if you want. And I used a reflexive thematic analysis approach. Now, thematic reflexive analysis regards meaning as being contextual, situated, regards realities or reality as being multiple, and above all, regards the subjectivity of the researcher as not only being valid, but an invaluable resource in the generation of meaning. So if you think of qualitative research as a sort of set of continua, and on the one hand, you could have very objective approaches and then move across to intersubjective approaches and then more subjective approaches. For example, an objective approach could be something like critical theory, and then moving across to pragmatism or phenomenology, or post-structural approaches, social constructionism and constructivism. This was very much at this end, at the constructivist end. And I can talk about, if you want, the epistemology and ontology of that, and how that related to methodology, etc. So I spent a lot of time actually working on the analyzing of the data, and it was a bit of an abductive dance, because you would find something in the empirical material and think, I need to read more about this. So the literature review, and Whisker says that the Whisker review appears to be a linear process, but it's actually an iterative process masquerading as a linear one. So lots of toing and froing over the literature according to the reactions that had been generated. I used an extensive memoing process as well. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember the 1970s, remember a Pepsi advert of sort of that gut. No, it wasn't gut rotting, because that wouldn't be quite an advert, really, would it? But it had a certain ring to it. But Saldana calls memos one's question raising, puzzle piercing, connection building, strategy building, problem solving, answer generating, rising above the data, heuristic. So I was using it as heuristic to memoing heuristic. I had 4 types of memos. I would have my aha perhaps moments. Well, I'd have an idea, and I had my engaged scholarship memos, because there was a very close relationship of engaged scholarship. And engaged scholarship is where you engage the combined expertise of the participants and the researcher or researchers to generate knowledge in a new area. I had wanted to do a collaborative action research, but ethically that would have been difficult because of the commitment required from the teacher educator. But I would write to her and ask her lots of questions, and she would, bless her cotton socks, respond. I would even send her bits of articles and think, well, does this match in with this? And is this what we're trying to create here? And is this the understanding? So you see this continual negotiation of meaning. So what we were doing was creating new and ever increasing layers of reality and of perception to try and bottom out what was happening in the processes in this classroom. So this ended up then in a series of themes, just 5 in total, and they were reduced down from 9. A lot of work going on in that respect. And the final themes were, and if you're a teacher educator, this may be quite interesting. The first one was called Orchestrating Lived Experiences. Remember, this is a teacher education classroom. The next one was Playing the Long Game, Beyond Tips for Monday Morning. So this is not a tips for teachers affair. This is something more serious. The next one was Creating an Invitational Vision. And the one after that was Learning from Challenge and Productive Failure. Failure actually played a massive part in this particular study, but it was productive failure. Lovely oxymoron, that from Kapoor. And the final one was Theorizing, the L word, so that's literature. So little snippets of reading, as opposed to the T word, which is sort of bigger set pieces of theory. So what does that mean then in terms of, that all comes together, and what does that mean in terms of implications for practice? So what insights were gained? Well, I'm claiming that the study shows how it's possible to bounce forwards and backwards between the conceptual and the concrete, and the conceptual. Remember, that's something that teacher educators, it's said, find quite difficult to do. And the key to doing that were two sub-themes, which I've called asynchronous and synchronous contingency management. I'll just pull those apart for you. Asynchronous contingency management, as it suggests, is something which doesn't happen in real time. In other words, you plan in advance to create havoc in your sessions. So you're going to get your students to be bewildered, puzzled, surprised. The teacher educator used the analogy of the sorcerer's apprentice. So if you've ever seen the Fantasia film, it's a good idea of creating the chaos there. And you do that on purpose, and you know how they're possibly going to react. Now, how the teacher educator did this was that she taught us a language they weren't familiar with, and this was Serbian. And they only had 4 lessons of Serbian, but there was a reverberation of the Serbian experiences throughout the 1 year of the study, and she would keep coming back to what they did. So she would tinker in purposeful ways with the teaching procedures to actually cause puzzlement and bewilderment and surprise, and she planned that in advance. So you actually have the paradox of planning for the unexpected. And then your contingency management is the skills that you use to deal with the students' reactions. But the students' reactions are real because they're real learners of Serbian and they're real learners of learning to teach. Much of the literature on modeling, because this is a form of modeling in a sense, is that it doesn't go beyond just role play. This wasn't role play. This was for real. It had felt facticity, personal meaning, and significance. So the interplay between those. So that was one insight. Another one is that the study, if you read it, suggests ways in which it's possible to create a productive dialogue between a theory into practice conception of teacher education and a practice makes practice conception of teacher education, and that can create then a symbiotic and dynamic an integrative relationship between theory and practice. So theory becomes the servant of practice and practice the servant of theory. This research also indicates very, very strongly, if you're into these sorts of things, how modeling can be made theoretical rather than atheoretical, how it can be made real rather than pretend, and how it can be made cathected, that's to say full of affective dimension, emotions as well as cognitive. And for me, the saddest finding in a sense was that the ability to exercise a high degree of expertise as a teacher educator is not entirely an essentialist quality of the teacher educator. The structural implications of the institution have a massive backwash effect, a very deleterious effect, in fact. And you may want to ask me about that. And finally, it shows ways in which student teachers can be shown a route which actually gets them to appreciate and prize theory as a friend, confidant, and guide, not only in their teacher education year, but the years ahead. And the implications for practice then are that it's essential that as a teacher educator, you need an open communicative space with what we're calling a tomorrow. In other words, there's continuity with your students, and that's a Deweyan concept of continuity and interaction. If you have a constricted space of no tomorrow, which is like going from module or student group to student group to student group, just doing one-off events, how can you on earth stand a chance of developing theoretical understanding? How can you develop a relationship, etc.? The teacher educator regarded us as factory teaching or a Dropbox approach, which is rather interesting. But if you do have that continuity and interaction, that means you can use, in Gardner's terms, multiple entry points. You can avoid coverage being the enemy of understanding, and you can play the long game. And you can go beyond tips for Monday morning, which implies a theoretical dimension. But if you've got a theoretical dimension, then how do you get students interested in theory? Well, there are one or two studies that indicate how to do this, and this backs them up very, very strongly, that it needs to be related to the students' practical expectations and experiences. It needs to grow out of their experiences. So it's a percept before precept basis. So in other words, they're experiencing something, and it's all about their thoughts, their feelings and emotions, and you go from that into getting to understand why they're thinking like they're thinking, and then you bring in perhaps a few principles, but you do it very, very carefully, drip-fed, parsimoniously, on that sort of basis. However, again, teacher educators find that difficult to do well, so the study shows how that can be done. Then another implication is that experiences need to strike both an affective and a cognitive chord, and that if you need to know how to orchestrate lived experiences that have felt significance, personal significance, and that's vital for getting the reflective traction that you require in order to help your students to see into practice, because it's all too easy to have the experience but miss the meaning, and that's where it's important for the teacher educator to be able to not only create those experiences but be able to unpick them. And the students were very appreciative of how that was done. And the idea there is to disrupt what is called the Apprenticeship of Observation. So if you're a non-teacher educator, Apprenticeship of Observation are the 13,000 hours you spent as a pupil watching teachers teach. And the problem there is you've only been privy to the surface functions of what the teacher was doing and how it affected you, not their internal thinking. So how, you're just making all sorts of assumptions about what was going on, which are probably likely to be wrong. So if you're going to disrupt the Apprenticeship of Observation, then another implication is that you need to take into account students' biographic pasts and help to show them how their biographic past affects their pedagogic present and future. However, if the students are going to run the risk of reconceptualization, remember, leaving a part of yourself behind to learn something new can be rather daunting. Then if they're going to run the risk of reconceptualization, then the teacher education classroom needs to be a place of refuge, of respite and reassurance. It needs to be a safe place for unsafe ideas. There needs to be a non-judgmental approach, and that was very strong coming through from the students. The teacher educator took a non-judgmental approach, and this is despite her wanting to promote a really quite distinctive methodology in language teaching. I called her approach non-evangelistic evangelism, because she really held back from pushing stuff, and the students appreciated that. And to give you an idea of their comments on that, the student said to me that what she does for us is that she opens up ipsative possibilities. She says she's meiotic in her approach because she allows us to access our latent understandings. Now you can see the level of language those students are using. They're using stuff from the methodology and theory of language teaching to actually use that as a lens on their on the pedagogy of teacher education, which I thought was fabulous. And the final implication is that I think teacher educators need help in how they can make the teacher education classroom a practice environment in and of itself. Okay, a practice environment, let's say a place where practice is theorized, and theory is not only considered for practice, it's also practiced as it's used to interrogate practice. So they're the implications, and that rounds it up.
Wow, thank you so much. Really fascinating. I would have thought that there's something there for everyone, even if you're not a teacher educator. So thank you, James.
You're welcome.
Really, really amazing study, I think. Can I just ask quickly, is there anywhere, is it published or is it on Insight? Is there any reference point where people can follow it up, or is it?
If you email me, I'll send it to you. I'm about to chop it up and use it. I'm going to use it as a springboard for, with Alison Jackson, we're going to study the pedagogy of teaching others to teach others to teach. If you can follow that one through, the pedagogy of teaching others to teach others to teach. And the insights from that I'm starting to use with a series of mentors and teacher educators I'm working with across a big national scheme. And that's going to be chopped up and used in that respect. But if anybody wants a copy of it, my email address is easy. It's James, James, as in Vernon Burch, Burch, @gmail.com, and I'll send you a copy. I suggest you, I wouldn't suggest going through the whole thing, but if you're a teacher educator, the most relevant parts for you, I think, are chapters 4 and 5, sections 4 and 5, because they really get underneath. People who are non-teacher educators who've read it have said, I couldn't wait to see what the students would say next. So there's a story in there that the students and the students carry it, I think, very, very strongly. So that was a bit of feedback from non-teacher educators.
Great, thank you. I don't know if anybody'd like to ask any questions. I'm going to monitor the text box now. I see there is someone typing at the moment, or even just to start off with, anybody like to ask something on their microphone? Can I just ask you one thing that's very simple, I suppose, question that you talked about the transcriptions, which must have been really extensive, that you'd asked a professional transcriber to do the first one and then decided that you were going to carry on yourself, and you had a lot, you seem to imply that you had a lot of insight from that. So I just wondered, is that just going over and over the data? And in fact, that might be quite useful for other people to think about.
Yeah, it was to a certain extent. I called it lost in transcription, because you were, when I got it was very professionally well done by a professional transcriber, but you tend to be removed from it, because when you're listening to it and transcribing it yourself, you're back in that situation. And I know you can listen to it and read what the transcriber's done, but somehow when you've got to think of where to put the punctuation, where to put the emphasis, what to emphasize, it just gave me, it really immersed me in a really intensive way in the data. And I actually kept doing that, re-listening to the data for a process of 2 years. It's called analyzing in the present. And that's from Tangard and Revsbeck, 2015, 2 Danish researchers. I found that by re-listening to the recordings and even hearing a little bit of intonation, I do these on bike rides and stuff like that. And analyzing the present is the work you do when you're not ordering data and when you're not analyzing data. It's that subconscious that's working away. And actually, I got some of the most interesting insights from that process. There was one piece of stumble data, as they call it, so something which really could even be way something is said and it takes you by surprise. And that was, I was discussing with the teacher educator what she was going to do in the next session. I said, that sounds really interesting. She says, yes, that's because I have a tomorrow. That was it. But that tomorrow was then contrasted with the constricted spaces in which she sometimes has to operate and the open communicative space. And just that word of a tomorrow set me and the teacher educator off on a whole series of ideas. So by continually re-listening to it, and also as your knowledge of the empirical material grows and your knowledge of the reading grows, your interpretation changes as well, because you're creating new levels of reality because your perceptions have increased. And it's a bit like a botanist. It's a bit like Nabokov looking at a lily. You know, if you're a naturalist looking at a lily, you'll see more than the layperson. If you're a botanist, you'll see more than the naturalist. And if you're a botanist dealing in lilies, specializing lilies, you have all sorts of layers of reality that others won't see. And if you're Joseph Paxton, who was the Duke of Devonshire's gardener, you'd see the outline of the Crystal Palace in the framework of the lily. So yeah, it's about creating reality in that sort of sense, about meaning making. So yeah, it was important. I will never ever do that again, but it was important.
Sounds a lot of data.
It was.
I have Just a comment from Rebecca Ackroyd. She's one of our PhD students. She's very sorry to have to leave. Very interesting in terms of the research angle, particularly in terms of the methodology and also the findings. So she thanks you for that.